Hello there, all of you absolutely lovely people. This is Dax Allred, and today I will be narrating The Light at the End, copyright 2022 by Brandon Dax Allred. The stone walls still pressed in on Jori with a cold indifference. He thought that was his name. Jori? The unkempt man struggled to remember. This happened a lot lately, at least he believed it was only a recent development. He really wasn't certain. How long had it been? How long since he'd looked upon the mountains and forests? The man struggled to focus, struggled to remember something of his life before these apathetic walls. A few insects could be heard buzzing around his head, and that familiar citrusy ache in his spine tried and failed to capture his attention. Was there a time before? Maybe not. Maybe he only believed that he remembered what it felt like to be warm, clean, and dry. There was a time when Jori, or whatever his name was, panicked at thoughts like these, but that was the past. How far into the past? He shuddered slightly. The man laid on the cold, wet floor, but only as much as those cramped, oppressive walls allowed. His atrophied joints screamed at him to be stretched out in the small space. They always screamed. He tried to imagine himself laying in a living meadow somewhere, someplace green. Jori hoped he remembered what such places looked like. The walls were hidden in the dark, but they were always there. They were the only things he couldn't forget. A distant popping noise echoed from somewhere beyond the locked door. Jori bolted up without realizing he had done so. What was that? That was the sound of... Another pop was heard, and another. Distant shouting echoed about. Silence. Thud. Thud, boom. Crack. Distant voices ricocheted around the spaces beyond that heavy door. Jori strained with all his might to hear the words. Only the occasional where or which one could be gleaned from the feast of sounds filling his atrophied ears. Periodically, a metallic jingling sound could be heard, followed by a scraping or creaking noise, and then muffled voices. But as these sounds proceeded, they got louder and more distinct. Ugh, this one's been dead for days. Another jingle and click, followed by scraping, and then some poor soul moaning. Is it him? I can't tell. This one's been down here for too long. Move on to the next one. More noises, followed by voices, still becoming more distinct. This one? No, not him. Jori lost count of how many times this series of events repeated themselves. Jingle, click, scrape, and some variation of the same conversation. Each time it got a little louder and a little clearer. Now foot scraping could be heard on the floor outside his own cell. Light outlined the door, but before any of the usual sounds could play out, they were interrupted by a new set of footsteps. Sir, sir! What is it, Gavers? We found him. He's dead. Looks like torture. Jori felt a thick, angry silence through the door. Sir, he's gone. We need to leave. There was so much rage in the voice that followed. Our daughters are not Jokundas. Jori was appalled by those blasphemous words. Sir? Came a cautious voice. Open the cells. All of them. But sir, our daughters are not Jokundas, repeated the treasonous statement. Severia deserves it. Open them now. With a loud, heavy creak, the cell door swung open and a light, brighter than creation itself, seared his eyes, blinding him. As the searing brightness blasted daggers of fire into his eyes, it began to speak. Looks like it's this poor bastard's lucky day, said the light with Gaver's voice. Move on to the next one. Yes, sir, came the other two voices, and with that the light faded, illuminating the space outside the cell. Jori's eyes still seared with pain as his irises clenched against the brightness, but they were seeing again, and what he saw was terrifying. That thick, heavy, open door stood there in the fading light, mocking him, taunting him, daring him. Through the open doorway, across the narrow hall, and peering out from a darkened cell on the other side, were another pair of eyes staring back at him. They were wide with fright. Quivering against the back wall, he sat staring at those frightened eyes as the last of the light faded away, leaving him in complete darkness again. Even hidden, the doorway mocked him. "Come through me, I dare you." Jori's ears perked up as the sounds of someone far braver than him fumbled their way through the darkness. "Hey, you! Which way?" A young man's voice inquired in the distance. Silence followed. "Come on, it's safe. The Droshnians let us out. We're free." He was answered by a forced shriek from someone's dry and unused throat. Fine, but it's safe. Deus has saved us." Jori shuddered at the false god's name. More sounds of someone feeling their way along the dark corridor could be heard. "Hey, is this the... Oh, you're dead." The noises were now outside his mocking doorway. The sound of Jori's heart flooded his senses. "Are you alive?" Jori made wild scraping noises as he scrambled to get as far away from that invasive voice as possible. "Oh, good! Which way to the door?" came the excited invader's ruthless interrogation. He tried to scream, yet his underused vocal cords could only produce the sounds of gasping air. "Oh, never mind. I see a light over there." The tension in the air relaxed as the young man's voice left his space, but even with the tension gone, his heart still drummed in his ears. More fumbling could be heard in the distance as someone gathered the courage to leave the tyrannical safety of their cell. Then another soul found their courage, and another. An old but long-lost urge was now welling up in Jori's heart. He barely recognized this sensation, yet it sparked memories of him running through fields and looking at distant mountains. The doorway sneered through the darkness. "You are weak, Jori. The outside will kill you." But the foreign desire still throbbed. Vague memories of a big blue sky filled his mind. "You are nothing but a wretched little man, but you are safe here." Something accompanied the need to stretch his arms and legs. "I demand you stay, weakling." The something became recognizable as Jori's newfound need grew. "Don't you dare," yelled the door. "Here you are safe." Excitement, accompanying the life or death need to escape, pushed Jori through the protesting door, only to be yanked down the hallway by the onrushing mass of other prisoners. The sounds of his own fumbling and scratching joined the chorus as the fetid odor of unwashed people filled the air. More prisoners fell in with the masses, scurrying in the direction everyone hoped would lead outside. A light became more visible in the distance. Jori was no longer even trying to move forward. His focus was on not getting trampled by the desperate river of cold, sweaty bodies squeezing through the narrow artery. Soon this river gushed out into an open room. As the bodies spilled out into the wider space, Jori found himself sprawled out chaotically on the floor. It felt so strange laying there. His spine screamed with sharp, painful joy as it stretched out into the unfamiliar position of being flat on the ground. The wooden planks of the floor felt so soft. The air was warm and dry. His arms and legs simply rested there, free to move as they wished. Despite the pressure on his frail ribcage, it felt like bliss. Silence. The chaos of the moment had passed him by, and he didn't care. Every joint in his body was now being pulled painfully by gravity into a shape that somehow resembled its natural state. It was joy. The new struggle was between two forms of pain. The pain of overstretching his body and breaking his weak ribs by laying there for too long, versus relieving his body by curling up into that vile, fetal position he'd been forced into for so many years. Once again, he was lost in time. Eventually, Jori somehow managed to stand up. Everything was blurry, but the room was lit. He could barely make out the three other people in there with him. The bones in his feet and shins felt like cracked glass, but they craved use, so Jori leaned against something and forced himself to step forward. It was a slow but eager struggle. The doors to the outside were open. Sounds, bright light, smooth fresh air, and the smell of elk dung pointed the way. A soldier of some kind entered the room from the cells from which Jori had just emerged. "Enjoy your freedom, guys. Give those Severians hell," came a gruff voice as he casually walked past Jori and out the open door. Jori didn't recognize the uniform, but it was clearly some sort of military garb, albeit for a poorly financed army. It was dark green and appeared to have a homemade gold lightning bolt stitched onto the left arm. His helmet was simple, with a large dent in the side where the paint had been scraped off to expose steel underneath. Jori was startled by the soldier's casual strength. He had completely forgotten what health looked like. Through the doorway, he watched the soldier saunter past the shredded chain fences and filthy recovering prisoners into the street where two other soldiers were standing. They were too far away for Jori's blurry vision to see much detail, but he overheard a few words. "Where's your firearm?" "Confiscated during the siege. The Hammers needed it for the wall assault," responded the same gruff voice from before. "Assholes. They did their job. We control the city. Not for long. The Karuka Guard have been pulled from the Adrada front. They're coming here in force. We've got 1 day to get out, if we're lucky." The second street soldier jumped in. "Wait until they see what we left for them," he laughed. "They're abandoning the Adrada Straits? That's not tactically... Wait, what did you say? What we leaving them? Come on, we'll show you. It's in Cathedral Park." The three walked off together. Jori hobbled his way into the outdoors. The living air was fresh, and the decorative trees dotted the pathways. Those sterile amber skyscrapers were everywhere, and stood in stark contrast to the ancient stone fortress he had just emerged from. He wanted to see a mountain. Jori then noticed some graffiti on the formerly pristine wall across the street. Absent-mindedly, he approached the markings while only vaguely remembering how to read. The name Jokunda sprang from his memory almost immediately. Next came recognition of the smaller words scrawled across the wall. Then his heart sank as he recognized it as the same phrase one of his liberators had used. "Our daughters are not Jokundas." He hated Jokunda, but this was blasphemy. What happened? What could have changed so much that something like this would be spoken so openly? How long was he... Splash! Cold mud showered Jori. An elk galloped along the street, cart in tow, seemingly unaware of him. Wiping the mud from his eyes, he noticed the tire tracks left by the cart. Although the bones in his shins felt brittle and the bottom of his feet throbbed, he needed to get away from that accursed riding, so he limped along, following the tracks. Soon Jori noticed that there were others traveling in the same direction. A man on elkback rode past him. Massive glass, amber, and steel buildings lined the metropolitan street. The great cathedral palace was now visible in the distance. And here was a tree. A big, beautiful tree so close he could touch it. Jori was hypnotized by the beauty of it all. It had pristine white bark and glorious green leaves dancing in the gentle breeze. There was a dead man hanging from one of the branches and glorious orange-colored fruit blossoming from the stems. Jori fell forward, embracing the trunk. He clung to this fellow living thing as years of forced isolation transformed into a moment of pure loving joy. He cried. Tears poured down his muddy face. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," he prayed. He found himself sitting against the tree, with a delectable piece of fruit on the ground next to him. He picked up the orange fruit and started tearing away at the leathery skin. Yellow juice dripped down his hands as he buried his face in the sweet and refreshing but fibrous flesh. His taste buds returned to life as the flavor sang to him. Jori was soon resting in a state of pure bliss. He laughed.
"You're good,"
came a tiny voice. Slowly he opened his eyes to see the glowing face of a goddess gazing at him. She had bright golden eyes, bronze skin, and blonde curly hair. Her white gown flowed in the gentle breeze. But as Jori's eyes adjusted, he realized this great deity was just a little girl.
"You're good,"
she repeated, and he was confused. He didn't see anyone who looked like they might be her parents. The few people on the street were moving toward the distant cathedral. The expressions on their faces ran from frightened to numb. Many were pulling carts or carrying bags, and strangely, very few people wore anything red. It wasn't until now that Jori noticed all the dead people. Some were wearing uniforms and laying in the street, but others appeared to have killed themselves. One older woman looked like she had been raped to death. His eyes went to the man hanging from the tree.
"He couldn't change,"
stated the little girl. She had a tear in her eye as she watched the swinging body. But then she returned her golden eyes back to Jori, held out her hand and repeated,
"You're good."
A group of soldiers walked by. "Hey, you two need to get moving." Who cares about them? They want to die, let them die. Man looks homeless. Girl looks like one of those little accepted bitches. I wish she was older. Always wanted to screw and accepted. The girl frowned at the soldiers as she took Jori's wet, frail, juice-covered hand and held on as if her life depended on it. He almost fell over. The first soldier frowned at the other two. They quickly straightened themselves up and apologized for their comments. The apologies seemed sincere. He turned back to Jori and the girl. "You two need to get out of here. There are carts giving people lifts out of town over at Temple Square. You need to be on one, now." He then took another look at the little girl before turning back to Jori. "If you see any of us, look for a shield patch on their arm. They're under specific orders to protect accepted girls." The three soldiers now turned and walked away. Jori looked at the child. She looked back at him as if he was some sort of hero. He was tired. Old and tired. He just wanted to sit there and rest. But the old prisoner struggled to his swollen feet. Together they limped towards the park. His shins felt like they were about to shatter, but they kept going. The girl didn't seem to care about the sticky fruit juice all over his hands.
"You're good,"
she repeated. It took a while and required several periods of rest, but as they approached the park, the people became a chaotic crowd. There was yelling and arguing. Everyone was wailing and shouting. All the noise, all the activity, all the people assaulted Jori's senses. He shut his eyes and tried to block out the sound. Somewhere in the distance, he felt a vague sensation of his hand being tugged forward. Someone bumped into him, but the girl still pulled him along. He wanted to crawl back into his cell and hide. There was another scream, but it wasn't him. Someone had pulled the little girl from his hand, taking her away. Jori reached for her. The crowd fought, but he fought back. He reached, and he stretched, and he took her hand. The girl grasped his hand with more strength than he could muster, and it hurt. But with what little strength he had, he pulled her back. Holding the girl, he briefly saw the frustrated expression of the man who had tried to take her, but the crowd swept the would-be kidnapper away. He wrapped his arms around the girl and held her tight, but without the strength left to hold her, he collapsed. He didn't fall to the ground, for there were too many people pushing against him, but he had spent the last of his strength saving her. Jori was walking on sheer willpower. It was now that he remembered the soldier telling him something about carts. They needed to get to the carts. Scanning through the tight throngs of people, he saw something that might have been a group of carts near the architectural marvels that were the city gates. So he brought his will to bear and pushed his way, clutching the girl as best he could. Being tossed about by the desperate mass of people, Jori slowly pushed the child closer to safety. This crowd was now shoved against an opposing crowd of soldiers, pushing with all its might. On the other side of the soldiers were several women wearing the same white gowns as the little girl. All the women were looking in the same direction and screaming. The soldiers were successfully holding back the onslaught of desperate refugees. One of the soldiers behind the line looked directly at Jori and the girl. He pulled a massive man with fair skin aside and pointed at them. The giant nodded and walked towards them. He marched up to both struggling crowds and passed through them effortlessly. He reached down and grabbed the girl. The girl and Jori both struggled to hold on to each other. Jori spent the last of his strength and began to collapse, just as the giant soldier grabbed them both and waded his way back to the commanding officer. "I told you to bring the girl." "Faster to grab them both," rumbled the deep voice of the giant. "Besides, look at them." The giant gently placed Jori and the girl down on the flat stones, where Jori promptly dropped to the ground. He was spent, but the girl still clung to him.
He's good,
she said to the soldiers.
You're good too.
The commanding officer looked at them both and sighed. Then he knelt down to the girl. "Do you remember where you lived before the recruiters accepted you?" The girl just looked back at the soldier. "Do you remember anything?"
There was a big tree. It made blue light."
The soldier looked at her for a moment before rolling his eyes. "We don't have time for this. The Karuka guard's coming. Tiro, get them out of here." "Yes, sir," rumbled the big man as he picked the two up in his arms. The next thing Jori knew, he was sitting on the back of an elk-drawn wagon. The girl was still clinging to his arm. The rest of the cart was filled with a mix of scared refugees, women in white gowns who were pointing and wailing at something, and two soldiers with shield patches on their arms. None wore any red. Looking down at the girl, Jori noticed she was looking in the same direction as the other accepted. Following their sightline, his eyes rested on a man in the distance. The dead man was tall and slender, with deep dark skin and a shaved head. He wore expensive red silks, was tied to a pillar, and had an ornate red and black spear sticking out of his gut. At his feet was a sign labeled with the name. Jori blinked in disbelief. The sign said, "Jokunda." "Jokunda? That can't be him. This is a lie. It must be. That can't be him."
"Can't be who?"
asked the girl. "Jokunda."
"It is,"
she responded.
"That's my husband."
"Gods can't die."
"I think they can. Look."
The girl was pointing at the dead man in red. Jori shuddered and curled up into his seat. One of the guards had been watching him with a concerned look on his face. "You didn't know?" he asked. "We strung him up last night when we took the city." The guard then turned his face to bask in the warmth of the bright light in the sky. There seemed to be a slight smile on his face. The world is a different place now.
"You want to save your sister."
The little girl's voice sounded matter-of-fact. The guard looked back at the girl. "How did—" And he shrugged. "Me and everyone else. Jokunda's stolen family from all of us. Looks like he stole you." The girl's already bright eyes seemed to radiate light.
"Your sister's not here. She's that way."
Her finger pointed off to the distance. Maybe the southwest.
"You're good."
At this point, almost everyone was watching the girl. Everyone except for the accepted women who were mourning the dead god. Then the soldier laughed. "Kids!" and the mood lightened. A cracking sound was heard and the wagon started rumbling forward. The jostling hurt Jori's frail bones, but the girl's grip on his arm prevented him from complaining. He watched the massive arch of the city gates pass overhead as they joined a train of wagons in the suburban town. The traffic slowly waned, and soon only a few people dressed in red clothing remained in the streets. The soldiers on the cart sneered at their garb, but nothing was said. Soon the wagon passed through yet another gate, and Jori found himself staring in awe at a living, green, mountainous landscape. Those mountains were so beautiful. Jori's eyes just drank it all in. Mountains, trees, a river, even animals. Jori didn't notice the time passing by. Suddenly, one of the green-clad soldiers rode by on another elk. "Here they come!" he shouted. "Here they come!" Distant explosions were heard from the sky. Jori looked back at the city to see massive black hammerhead-shaped Kurukan airships dropping hundreds of thousands of invincible warriors onto the amber and steel metropolis below. The sight looked more like swarms of bugs descending upon a corpse than a battle. Bursts of light flashed everywhere. Thanks Saranda we're safe from that. The little girl glanced at the carnage before looking up into Jori's eyes.
Where are we going now?
And that was The Light at the End, written in 2022 by myself, Dax Allred. If you enjoyed this story, I would really appreciate it if you would like and subscribe, maybe even click that bell icon. This was probably the third or fourth short story I've written for a book I'm working on, tentatively called Legends of Earth. I have no idea if this will be the final name, but it's my working title. So, Light at the End. This one started out as a writing exercise. The whole concept simply started with, let's write a story about a guy trapped alone in a room, and it went from there. When I started writing, I had no idea why he was there, but I definitely wanted him to be a good person. I wanted him to be someone who didn't deserve to be locked away and forgotten. But I also didn't want it to be the old person imprisoned for a crime they didn't commit trope. Fortunately, once I got into the world building, the civilization itself kind of demanded his reason for being there. I mean, why would you be imprisoned in a society where only the lives of 3 people on the entire planet are valued? You know, my thinking was that imprisonment requires effort, resources. They have to have the prison, they have to guard you, they have to feed you. If you aren't one of the 3 people who matter, then it's just more cost-effective to kill you and throw you in a mass grave somewhere. It's pure soulless economics, unless you're a piece on the board. And in Jori's case, a minor piece, one who didn't even know he was one. I've written a semi-sequel to this story, one which follows Tanara after she's already grown up, but it does explain Jori's backstory a little bit more. I will be posting that at a later time. Also, I liked the idea of this civilization getting what it deserved, which of course, what does a tyrannical society deserve? It deserves not to exist anymore. So everything what these 3 god kings have worked so hard to build, it's falling apart over the course of this story. And obviously, how do you topple a god? You do it by proving that they aren't gods. Anyway, this was A Light at the End by Dax Allred. All rights reserved. I hope you enjoyed it, and may you have a wonderful day. I love you all.